The wind didn't just howl, it screamed, a predatory sound that tore through the thin glass of Amara's windshield. At 2:00 a.m., the Chicago Skyway was a graveyard of white, a void where the road ended and the abyss began. Amara gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles as pale as the drifts piling against the concrete barriers. Her shift at the ER had ended 3 hours ago, but the blizzard had turned a 20-minute commute into a desperate crawl for survival. "Just a few more miles," she whispered, her breath blooming in thick, ragged clouds. The car's heater was losing the war against the negative 30-degree front, and the low fuel light flickered like a dying heartbeat on her dashboard. Then she saw it. A splash of violent, impossible color against the blinding white. Amara slammed on the brakes. The car fishtailed, tires screaming against the black ice before lurching to a halt inches from a snowbank. She squinted through the frost. There, poking out from a fresh drift, was a small, bright red mitten. It was a red-on-snow anchor, a visual scream for help. The logical part of her brain, the part trained in clinical triage, told her to stay in the car, to call it in. But the signal was dead, and the mitten was too small. It wasn't the size of a man's hand, it was the size of a promise. Amara threw the door open. The cold hit her like a physical blow, a wall of ice that sucked the oxygen straight from her lungs. She stumbled into the knee-deep powder, her thin blue scrubs offering zero protection against the needles of frost biting into her skin. She reached the mitten and pulled. Her heart stopped. The mitten was attached to a hand, a small, limp hand. She began to dig frantically, her fingers turning into useless blocks of ice as she swept away the heavy crust of the drift. Beneath the snow lay a boy no older than 6. He was dressed in a bespoke, midnight blue wool coat and a silk tie, outfits for a gala, not a graveyard. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, a child of immense wealth, discarded in a frozen wasteland. Amara pulled him into her arms. He was terrifyingly light, his skin the color of marble. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck. Nothing. She moved to his wrist. There, a thready, desperate flutter, a heartbeat, but only just. "Stay with me, baby," she gasped, her voice cracking as the wind tried to steal her words. She fought her way back to the car, shielding his small body with her own. As she laid him across the back seat, the metallic silver of a high-end thermal lining in his coat caught the dim cabin light, flickering like a signal fire. He was a mystery wrapped in luxury and ice, and as Amara began chest compressions with frozen hands, she knew one thing: the storm hadn't brought him here, someone had. The car skidded into the hospital's ambulance bay, fishtailing against the concrete as Amara leaned on the horn. She didn't wait for the security guards to reach her. She lunged into the back seat, scooped the boy's rigid body into her arms, and sprinted toward the sliding glass doors. The transition from the sub-zero darkness to the fluorescent, sterile heat of the ER was a sensory assault, but Amara's mind had already shifted into a cold, clinical gear. "Pediatric arrest, hypothermic, I need a crash cart and a bear hugger now," she shrieked, her voice cutting through the hum of the night shift. The chaos of the emergency room organized itself around her in seconds. Doctors and nurses swarmed, but Amara remained the anchor. She laid the boy on the trauma bed, his small frame looking hauntingly fragile against the white sheets. His bespoke suit was now ruined, soaked through with melted snow, and his lips were a terrifying shade of indigo. Starting compressions, Amara gritted out. She climbed onto the step stool, locking her elbows. The rhythmic thud-thud-thud of her hands against his chest was the only thing keeping death at bay. "Vitals are crashing," a nurse called out, her voice tight. "Heart rate is 20 and falling. Core temp is 82. "He's too cold to jumpstart," the attending physician muttered, hovering over the monitor. "Keep the compressions going. We need to warm his blood or the meds won't even circulate." Amara didn't stop. Her arms burned, the muscles screaming from the exertion and the lingering chill of the storm, but she stared intensely at the boy's face. Seo Jun. He looked like a porcelain doll, beautiful and broken. Every time she pressed down, she felt the sickening give of his ribs, a reminder of how high the stakes were. One wrong move and his heart would simply quit. "I'm losing the pulse," the tech whispered. The monitor emitted a long, slow moan, the flatline of a code blue. "Charging to 50, the doctor shouted. clear. Amara stepped back, her hands hovering in the air, trembling. The boy's body arched as the current surged through him. He landed back on the mattress with a heavy thud. Nothing. The line remained flat. Again, charging to 70, clear. Another jolt. Amara's eyes were fixed on the boy's throat, watching for the slightest flicker of a carotid pulse. She felt a surge of righteous fury at the unfairness of it, a child left to die in a suit that cost more than her car. "Come on, Seo-jun," she hissed under her breath. "Fight." On the third shock, the monitor let out a sharp, erratic beep, then another. It was weak, stumbling and far too slow, but it was a rhythm. The biological tension in the room snapped like a violin string. Amara collapsed against the supply cabinet, her lungs finally drawing in a full breath, even as the sliding doors at the far end of the hall were suddenly blown open by men in dark suits who didn't look like doctors. The heavy scent of ozone and wet wool preceded the invasion before the first boot hit the linoleum. The sliding glass doors of the ER didn't just open, they hissed back as if retreating from a threat. A phalanx of men in razor-sharp charcoal suits moved in a synchronized surge, their expressions as cold and immovable as the blizzard outside. They didn't ask for directions, they took the space, fanning out to block the exits with a practiced, military precision that turned the sterile sanctuary into an occupied zone. At the center of the storm was Choi Kang-Soo. He didn't look like a grieving father, he looked like a god of vengeance. His black overcoat billowed behind him, trailing the scent of expensive tobacco and the biting winter air. His eyes, dark and predatory, scanned the trauma ward with a lethal intensity that made the senior attending physician freeze mid-sentence. Behind him, the low-slung bulges beneath the suits of his men made it clear that security was a polite euphemism. "Where is he?" Kang-Soo's voice was a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated in the small room. It wasn't a question, it was a demand for the world to realign itself to his will. The hospital staff instinctively recoiled, the rhythm of the ER shattering under the weight of the power inversion. Nurses who were used to managing chaos suddenly found themselves breathless, faced with a man who commanded a different kind of life and death. The security guard at the desk made a move for his radio, but a single, silent look from one of Kang-Soo's lieutenants, a man with a jagged scar bisecting his eyebrow, stilled the guard's hand. Amara stood at the foot of the bed, her scrubs still stained with the boy's melted snow and her own sweat. She felt the shift in the air, the way the clinical authority of the hospital was being sucked out of the room, replaced by a raw, criminal magnetism. Kang-Soo's gaze locked onto her, then dropped to the small, pale figure hooked up to the monitors. The shattered elite cracked for a fraction of a second. The absolute control in Kang-Soo's face flickered as his eyes landed on the intubation tube and the erratic rhythm of the heart monitor. His hands, which had likely signed death warrants with a steady stroke, trembled almost imperceptibly as he took a step toward the bed. "Don't," Amara said. The word was a sharp, clear strike against the heavy silence. The 10 armed men shifted, a collective tightening of muscle and leather, but Amara didn't move. She stepped between the Mafia boss and the child, her small frame a defiant shield against the encroaching dark. In this space, the suits and the guns were irrelevant. The only power that mattered was the one pulsing weakly in the boy's chest, and she was its only guardian. The air in the trauma bay turned electric, the kind of heavy, ionized stillness that precedes a lightning strike. 10 men, each a professional instrument of violence, tightened their circle. The clicking of safety catches being disengaged echoed against the tiled walls like a series of metallic heartbeats, but Amara Nwosu didn't flinch. She planted her feet, her gaze leveled at Choi Kang-Soo with a righteous fury that burned hotter than the heaters in the ceiling. "Move, woman," the man with the scarred eyebrow hissed, stepping forward. He didn't draw a weapon, but his presence was a physical weight designed to crush resolve. Amara didn't even look at him. Her eyes remained locked on Kang-Soo's. "You are not wearing a mask, you are not wearing gloves, and you are bringing the filth of the street into a sterile field where a child is clinging to life by a thread." "That is my son," Kang-Soo roared, the sound tearing from his throat with the raw agony of a wounded predator. He took a step toward the bed, his hand reaching out for Seo-jun's limp, pale fingers. "And I am his nurse," Amara countered, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk that commanded the room. She stepped into his personal space, her chest nearly touching the fine wool of his overcoat. "Right now, your son's immune system is failing. His heart is irritable. If you touch him, if you shock his system with the bacteria on your hands or the stress of your presence before he is stabilized, you might as well finish what the blizzard started." The silence that followed was suffocating. The bodyguards looked to Kang-Soo, waiting for the signal to discard the woman who dared to speak to the head of the Choi syndicate as if he were a disobedient child. Kang-Soo's jaw flexed, his eyes searching Amara for a flicker of fear, the currency he traded in. He found nothing but the cold, hard steel of professional duty. This was the high-stakes defiance. Amara was a woman of modest means, her only weapon a stethoscope, yet she held the city's most dangerous man at bay with the sheer force of her moral authority. "He needs a central line," Amara said, her tone shifting back to the clinical, ignoring the guns pointed at her periphery. "He needs a slow, rewarming protocol. If you want him to live, you will take your men and stand behind that red line on the floor. You will wait until I tell you it is safe." Kang-Soo stared at her for a long, agonizing beat. Then slowly he lowered his hand. He looked at Seo-jun, so small and buried under the silver thermal blanket, and then back at the nurse who had pulled him from the white void. With a sharp, jerky motion, he signaled his men. They retreated 3 steps, stopping exactly behind the red tape of the trauma zone. "You have 1 hour," Kang-Soo rasped, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and respect. "If his heart stops again, yours will follow." Amara didn't even acknowledge the threat. She turned her back on the Mafia boss and picked up a fresh pair of gloves. "Then stay out of my way and let me work." The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator was the only sound in the bay as the rewarming blankets finally did their work. Amara watched the monitor, her eyes tracking the steady, rising climb of Seo-jun's core temperature. Beside her, the silver catalyst, the metallic emergency foil, crinkled softly as the boy stirred. It was a minute movement, a mere twitch of a finger, but it sent a physical jolt through the room. Behind the red line, Kang-Soo remained a statue of dark-tailored wool, his breath held in a state of agonizing suspension. Seo-jun's eyelashes fluttered, dark against the translucent marble of his skin. He groaned, a small, hollow sound that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. Amara leaned in, her voice a gentle anchor. "Hey there, little hero, you're safe, you're in the hospital." The boy's eyes drifted open, clouded and unfocused, before locking onto Amara's face. For a moment, there was a flash of pure celestial recognition, the angel who had pulled him from the white void. But then, his gaze drifted past her, finding the towering, dark silhouette of the man standing in the shadows. The heart monitor suddenly began to chirp, a rapid, frantic beeping that signaled a spike in adrenaline. "Seo-jun," Kang-Soo choked out, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that paralyzed his bodyguards. He took a predatory, desperate step forward, crossing the red line, his arms reaching out to reclaim the piece of his soul he thought he'd lost. But the reaction wasn't the joyous reunion the room expected. As Kang-Soo approached, Seo-jun's small body recoiled. He scrambled backward against the elevated head of the bed, his breath coming in sharp, terrified gasps. He didn't reach for his father, he reached for Amara, his small, cold hand gripping her scrub sleeve with a strength born of pure panic. "No," the boy whimpered, his voice a ragged whisper. Don't let him take me back." The silence that followed was more violent than a gunshot. Kang-Soo froze, his hands hanging uselessly in the sterile air. The shattered elite didn't just crack, he crumbled. The confusion in the boss's eyes was eclipsed by a dawning, horrific realization. His son wasn't afraid of the storm, and he wasn't afraid of the men with guns. He was afraid of the world his father had built. Amara placed a protective arm around the boy's shaking shoulders, her gaze shifting from the child to the Mafia lord. The mystery hook hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. The boy hadn't wandered into the blizzard by accident. He had been running. And as Amara felt the child's heart hammering against her own ribs, she realized the man standing before her wasn't just the boy's savior. He might be the very monster the child was trying to escape. The atmosphere in the trauma bay grew heavy with an unspoken, chilling tension. While Kang-Soo stood paralyzed by his son's rejection, the double doors at the end of the corridor hissed open. A man in pristine surgical blues walked in, a stethoscope draped around his neck and a chart clutched in his hand. He moved with a practiced, rhythmic grace, but to Amara's trained eyes, something was fundamentally wrong. His gait was too heavy, his shoulders too rigid for a doctor who had spent 12 hours on his feet. "I'm here for the pediatric consult," the man said, his voice a flat, clinical monotone. He didn't look at Kang-Soo or the armed men flanking the walls. He kept his eyes fixed solely on Seo-jun. Amara felt a cold prickle of intuition crawl up her spine. The thriller spike hit her before the man even reached the bedside. In a busy ER, doctors were a blur of movement and exhausted sighs, but this man was too still, too focused. As he reached into his pocket, he didn't pull out a penlight or a thermometer. His fingers gripped something silver and slender. "Step back, nurse," the man commanded, his tone shifting from clinical to lethal. Amara didn't move. She noticed the way the surgeon's mask didn't quite hide the predatory hardness in his eyes that weren't looking to heal, but to extinguish. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, the object in his hand glinted. It wasn't a standard medical tool, it was a custom-weighted blade, an assassin's scalpel designed for a single, silent strike. "Wait," Amara said, her voice a sharp, warning bell. "I haven't cleared him for a consult yet." The man ignored her, his arm tensing for a downward thrust toward the boy's carotid artery. In that microsecond, the clinical versus criminal theme reached a fever pitch. Amara didn't think, she acted on pure, protective instinct. She slammed her foot down on the bed's brake release and shoved the heavy gurney with all her might. The metal frame collided with the hitman's midsection, throwing his aim off. The blade hissed through the air, slicing through the silver thermal blanket instead of the boy's flesh. The sound of the foil tearing was like a scream in the sudden silence. "Gun," the man with the scarred eyebrow roared from the red line. The ward erupted into a chaotic blur of motion. Kang-Soo's grief vanished, replaced instantly by the lethal reflexes of a man who had survived 1,000 betrayals. But the hitman was fast, pivoting away from the gurney and reaching for a concealed firearm beneath his scrubs. Amara threw herself over Seo-jun, her body a human shield, as the sterile sanctuary of the hospital finally shattered into a battlefield. The shadow of the Mafia had found them, and this time it had brought a blade. The sound of suppressed gunfire splintered the air, a series of muffled thuds that sent glass raining down like lethal diamonds. "Get down," Kang-Soo roared, his voice no longer that of a grieving father, but a general in a war zone. He lunged over the gurney, his heavy overcoat flared out like wings, shielding both Amara and his son as his men returned fire. "We can't stay here," Amara gasped, her hands still pressed firmly over Seo-jun's ears to drown out the violence. "The main elevators are a death trap, and they've clearly compromised security." Kang-Soo looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers for a tremor that wasn't there. He saw only the cold, hard logic of a woman who dealt with life and death every day. This was the Dark Pact, a moment where the king of the underworld had to yield to the queen of the clinic. "Where?" he demanded. "The service tunnels. They lead to the old basement laundry," she replied, already unhooking the boy from the heavy wall monitors and switching him to a portable oxygen tank. "If we can get him there, I can keep him stable until your reinforcements arrive. But you have to do exactly what I say." Kang-Soo nodded once, a sharp, jagged motion. He grabbed the end of the gurney, his knuckles white against the chrome. Together, they shoved the bed through the rear exit, racing past the frantic chaos of the nursing station into the dim, flickering shadows of the service corridor. The air here was heavy with the scent of industrial bleach and ancient dust, a stark contrast to the copper tang of blood they had left behind. They moved in a frantic, rhythmic synchronization, an unlikely alliance forged in the belly of the hospital. Amara guided the gurney around sharp corners and through heavy steel doors, while Kang-Soo kept his weapon raised, his eyes scanning every shadow for the glint of a hitman's blade. They were two predators from different worlds, united by the fragile, shallow breathing of the child between them. As they reached the freight elevator, the power surged and groaned. "The lines are being cut," Amara whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "We move faster," Kang-Soo rasped. He looked down at his son, whose small hand was still tucked into the crook of Amara's elbow. For the first time, he didn't try to reclaim the boy. He stepped back, providing the perimeter while she provided the care. In the flickering light of the descending lift, the Mafia boss and the nurse shared a silent, grim understanding. In the darkness of the basement, social status was dead. There were only the hunters, the hunted, and the guardian standing in between. The basement was a labyrinth of weeping pipes and rhythmic, industrial thumping, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete. They moved through the darkness, the only light the rhythmic, green pulse of Seo Jun's portable monitor. Amara pushed the gurney with a desperate, adrenaline-fueled strength, her eyes searching for the laundry chute alcove she knew offered the only true cover. A shadow detached itself from the steam-filled gloom of the boiler room. There was no warning, only the flash of a suppressed muzzle and the sharp ping of a bullet ricocheting off the gurney's metal frame. Kang-Soo spun, his weapon clearing his holster in a blur of lethal motion, but Amara was already moving. As the hitman adjusted his aim toward the small, defenseless figure on the bed, Amara threw her body across Seo Jun. The impact wasn't a scream, it was a dull, wet thud. Amara gasped, a sharp bloom of heat radiating from her shoulder, but she didn't let go. She pulled the silver thermal blanket higher, shielding the boy's head as Kang-Soo ended the threat with two precise, thunderous shots that echoed like cannons in the confined space. Silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. Kang-Soo dropped to his knees beside the bed, his face a mask of primal terror. He didn't look at the fallen assassin. He looked at the dark, spreading stain blooming across Amara's blue scrubs. The blood was a vivid, terrifying contrast, the life force of a woman who had no reason to bleed for him. "You're hit," Kang-Soo rasped, his voice cracking. He reached out, his large, scarred hands trembling as he touched her shoulder. "Check the boy," Amara wheezed, her face turning the color of ash. She clutched the side of the gurney, her knuckles white. "Check the seals on his oxygen." Kang-Soo froze. He was a man who owned the city's skyline, a man who could buy and sell lives with a flick of his wrist. He viewed the world in hierarchies, and in his world, a nurse from the South Side was a nobody, a cog in a machine he sat atop. Yet here she was, leaking her own life onto the concrete to save a child who wasn't hers, standing as a wall between his son and the grave. The emotional pivot was a physical blow. He realized that for all his power, he was bankrupt. He owed a debt that no amount of money could settle, a blood debt to a woman who had nothing but her courage. "I have him," Kang-Soo whispered, his gaze shifting from his son to Amara with a look of profound, shattered respect. "I have you both." He stripped off his designer overcoat, the $1,000 wool now nothing more than a bandage, and pressed it against her wound. As Amara's eyes flickered, struggling to stay open, the Mafia boss leaned in close. "Stay with me, nurse. The world is not done with you yet, and neither am I." The sirens of Kang-Soo's private security fleet finally cut through the blizzard's roar, their red and blue lights reflecting off the basement's damp walls like a herald of the end. Within minutes, the hospital was purged. The rival faction, the men who had turned a house of healing into a slaughterhouse, were dismantled with a cold, surgical efficiency that left no room for mercy. Kang-Soo stood in the center of the wreckage, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his hands stained with the dust of the basement and the blood of the woman who had saved his life. Amara sat on the floor, leaning against an industrial dryer, her shoulder bandaged with the remnants of a king's coat. Her face was pale, but her eyes were twin embers of uncompromising steel. Beside her, Seo Jun slept fitfully, his small hand still tucked into hers. "It is over," Kang-Soo said, his voice echoing in the hollow space. He looked at his lieutenants, men who lived and died by the gun, and then back at the nurse. "The threat is gone. I will move you both to a private facility. You will have everything, the best care, the best security. You will never want for anything again." "No," Amara said. The word was soft, but it stopped the Mafia boss in his tracks. She looked up at him, ignoring the throbbing pain in her shoulder. "You think this is about security? You think you can buy a clean slate with a new hospital wing and more armed guards?" She gestured to the sleeping boy. "He didn't run away because he was being hunted, Kang-Soo. He ran away because he saw what you are. He saw the darkness that follows you, the shadow that just put a bullet in a nurse and a blade through his bed. Kang-Soo's jaw tightened, the shattered elite, retreating behind a mask of cold authority. I am protecting him. This world is the only way I can keep him safe. Then you've already lost him, Amara countered, her voice rising with a final, desperate clarity. He woke up and he was terrified of you, not the hitmen, you. She stood up slowly, using the gurney for support, her gaze never wavering. You have a choice to make right here in the dark. You can keep your empire, your guns, and your protection, and watch that boy wither away in a golden cage of fear. Or you can walk away. You can be the father he needs instead of the ghost he's running from. The ultimate choice hung between them, heavier than the concrete ceiling. Kang-Soo looked at his men, then at the city he ruled, and finally at the small boy who was the only pure thing he had ever touched. The silence stretched until it was agonizing. If I stay, Kang-Soo rasped, I am a target. If you stay as you are, he is the target, Amara corrected. Choose, Choi Kang-Soo, the mob or the boy, you don't get both. 6 months later, the Chicago spring arrived with a fragile, insistent warmth that finally chased the memory of the blizzard from the city's bones. Amara pushed through the double doors of the ER for the start of the night shift, her shoulder giving only a faint, dull ache, a permanent souvenir of the night the world turned upside down. She expected the usual chaos, the flickering fluorescent lights, the peeling linoleum, and the rhythmic groan of the outdated ventilation system. Instead, she stepped into a transformation. The ward was bathed in a soft, recessed glow that replaced the harsh clinical glare of the past. The old, rattling gurneys were gone, replaced by state-of-the-art trauma beds that glided silently across a brand-new hospital floor. In the corner, where Seo-jun had once fought for his life, a high-tech pediatric stabilization unit now stood, its monitors humming with a quiet, expensive precision. Amara, you're not going to believe the paperwork, the head nurse said, leaning over a sleek new mahogany desk. A blind trust, no name, no strings, just a note saying the city deserves a guardian who doesn't have to fight the equipment as hard as she fights for the patients. Amara ran her hand over the cool, sterile surface of a new monitor. She didn't need to see a signature to know the source. This was a redemption payoff, a king's ransom paid to ensure that no other child would ever have to rely on a broken heater or a dying car battery to survive the night. A soft sound at the entrance made her turn. Standing near the triage desk was a young boy with rosy cheeks and a bright, infectious smile. He was no longer a porcelain doll. He was a child of the sun, dressed in a simple cotton t-shirt and jeans. He held a bouquet of sunflowers, their yellow petals a vivid new dawn against the hospital's blue walls. Amara, Seo-jun called out, racing forward to wrap his arms around her waist. Amara knelt, hugging him tightly, her eyes drifting toward the sliding glass doors. Parked at the curb was a modest, unassuming sedan, not a luxury SUV or a tank of blacked-out glass. A man sat behind the wheel, his silhouette softened by the morning light. He didn't step out, he didn't demand attention. He simply waited, a father watching his son live a life that didn't require a shield. Choi Kang-Soo had made his choice. The crown was gone, replaced by the quiet, heavy burden of being a man. As they drove away, Amara realized that the blizzard hadn't just been a storm, it had been a clearing. The clinical and the criminal had collided, and in the wreckage, something whole had finally begun to grow. Will Choi Kang-Soo's past stay buried, or will the shadows of the syndicate return for revenge? Subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch the next high-stakes episode of The Nurse and the King.